High Commander had studied warfare for 300 cycles. In all that time, across 17 species and 4 dimensions, she had never encountered a problem she could not solve through calculation. War was mathematics. It was angles and numbers and the careful movement of pieces across a board. Every species she had ever encountered understood this truth. They fought with crystalline precision, their formations so perfect that you could measure the distance between each soldier down to the smallest unit. The chittering ones moved as swarms, each individual acting as part of a greater whole, their attacks flowing like water around obstacles. The beings of Dimension 7 existed as pure thought, and they waged war through geometric patterns so complex that lesser minds could not even perceive them. Had mastered them all. She had committed their doctrines to memory. She had run 10,000 simulations and won 10,000 victories. She understood war the way she understood breathing. Then the scouts discovered Earth. The report arrived on an ordinary morning, flagged as low priority. A new species had been detected in a distant corner of a minor dimension. They called themselves humans. They had barely achieved travel between the planets of their own system. Their technology was primitive. Their bodies were fragile things that required constant maintenance, food, water, sleep, emotional support. They lived for barely a century before dying of simple old age. By every metric the Convergence used to evaluate military threats, humanity should have been classified as negligible. Almost deleted the report without reading it. But something in the data caught her attention. The scouts had done what scouts always did. They had observed. And when they found records of human conflicts, they had collected those too, thinking that the Convergence's war simulation systems might find them useful for training purposes. The simulations ran automatically, and the results were so strange that the system flagged them for command review. Opened the first simulation with mild curiosity. A human general named Hannibal had faced a vastly superior force. The logical response would have been retreat, or negotiation, or the careful construction of defensive positions. Instead, this Hannibal had done something that made no sense at all. He had marched his army through mountains that everyone agreed were impassable. He had brought massive animals called elephants across terrain where such creatures should have died by the hundreds. He had lost soldiers to cold and hunger and the simple difficulty of the journey. And then he had emerged behind his enemies and destroyed them. Ran the simulation again, this time pitting Hannibal against the crystalline phalanx. They were legendary for their defensive formations. No force in the known dimensions had ever broken a line through direct assault. Hannibal did not attempt a direct assault. He simply went around, through terrain that the simulation classified as impassable, using a route that no rational commander would ever consider. He won in 14 moves. Felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. She felt uncertain. She pulled more records, more human generals, more simulations. A one-eyed naval commander called Nelson had faced a superior fleet. The established rules of naval engagement demanded careful maneuvering, the preservation of formation, the seeking of advantageous positions. Nelson had apparently never read these rules. He had simply sailed his ships directly into the enemy formation, breaking it apart through sheer audacity. The chaos that followed should have destroyed his fleet. Instead, it destroyed his enemies. When ran Nelson against the chittering one's swarm tactics, the result was the same. The swarm relied on coordination, on the precise movement of thousands of individuals acting as one. Nelson's approach shattered that coordination. His ships moved as individuals, each captain making decisions in the moment, adapting to chaos rather than trying to impose order upon it. The swarm lost in 23 moves. Spent the next rotation reviewing human military history. She did not eat. She did not rest. She simply sat in her command chamber, running simulation after simulation, watching human generals defeat enemies they had no right to defeat. A general named Alexander had conquered half his world before the age of 33. A commander called Caesar had entire regions through a combination of brutal efficiency and unexpected mercy. A warlord named Khan had built the largest land empire in human history by adapting the tactics of his enemies and turning them into weapons. And then there was. This one broke something in his understanding. Had been a strategist in an ancient human kingdom. He had found himself in a city with almost no defenders, facing an army that outnumbered him by a factor of 50. The logical response would have been surrender or desperate flight, or a final stand that might at least preserve honor. Had ordered the city gates opened. He had sent his few soldiers away from the walls, instructing them to sweep the streets and act as though nothing unusual was happening. And then he had climbed to the top of the wall, sat down with a musical instrument, and begun to play. The enemy army had stopped. Their general had studied the open gates, the apparently undefended city, the calm figure playing music above it all, and he had concluded that it must be a trap. Why else would anyone behave this way? There must be hidden forces. There must be some strategy he could not perceive. The enemy army retreated, had won a battle by doing nothing at all. Ran the simulation 12 times. Each time, the result was the same. The tactic should not work. It violated every principle of defensive positioning. It relied entirely on the enemy's assumption that no one would ever be stupid enough to actually leave a city undefended. And yet it worked, not always, not against every enemy, but often enough that had survived to employ it. Convened an emergency council. The other high commanders arrived expecting a minor administrative matter. They found standing before a display screen, her scales shifting through colors they had never seen her wear before. "We have a problem," she said. She showed them the simulations. She showed them Hannibal crossing the mountains. She showed them Nelson breaking the line. She showed them playing music while his enemies retreated in confusion. Commander L was the first to speak. His 12 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep processing. "How does that work?" he demanded, pointing at the simulation. "It violates every principle of defensive positioning. The city was empty, he had nothing, and he won." "It should not work," agreed. "By every calculation we know how to make, it should fail catastrophically. The enemy should have simply walked into the city and captured it." Then why did they not? Had been asking herself that question for an entire rotation. She had finally arrived at an answer, and it disturbed her more than anything she had encountered in 300 cycles of warfare. "Because they were thinking logically," she said. "They saw an impossible situation and assumed there must be a hidden explanation. They could not imagine an enemy who would simply gamble everything on their inability to believe what they were seeing." The council chamber was silent. "These humans," Commander said slowly, "they are dangerous." "They are primitive," L objected. "They have barely reached their own moon. They cannot threaten us." "Not yet," said, "but they learn quickly. They adapt. They take the tactics of their enemies and improve upon them. And they do things that no logical species would ever attempt." She brought up the final display, a projection of humanity's technological development curve. "In 200 cycles, perhaps less, they will develop the capability to reach other dimensions. And when they do, they will bring their generals with them, their Hannibals and their Nelsons and they will face our finest strategists, and they will do things that we cannot predict because we cannot imagine anyone being foolish enough to try them." The council voted unanimously. The Human Tactical Studies Division was established before the rotation ended. Its mission was simple: understand human warfare before humanity could bring that warfare to the stars. Hope they had enough time. Subcommander Eth had served the Convergence faithfully for 40 cycles. She had fought in 3-dimensional wars. She had earned commendations for tactical excellence. She had never questioned an assignment. but when she received orders to lead the first research cohort into human military history, she very nearly refused. The other researchers had already begun calling it punishment duty. Everyone knew that the Human Tactical Studies Division was a dead end, a project born from the High Commander's temporary obsession with a primitive species. They would study these humans for a few rotations, file some reports that no one would read, and then the whole thing would be quietly dissolved. Eth accepted the assignment anyway. She had read the initial simulations, and something about them would not leave her mind. She assembled a team of 12 researchers, each specializing in a different aspect of warfare. They requisitioned the most advanced analytical systems the Convergence possessed, and then they began the long process of immersing themselves in humanity's violent history. The first rotation was simply overwhelming. Humans had been fighting each other for as long as they had existed. They had records of conflicts stretching back thousands of their years. They had developed countless weapons, countless tactics, countless ways of killing each other. Eth had expected to find patterns. Every species developed patterns. The had their crystalline doctrines. The chittering ones had their swarm protocols. Even the chaotic beings of Dimension 3 eventually settled into predictable behaviors. Humans refused to settle into anything. "Look at this," one of her researchers said, displaying records from something called the Second World War. "This general, they called him the Desert Fox. Do you know why?" Eth studied the records, had commanded armored forces in a region of sand and heat. His enemies had possessed superior numbers, superior supplies, superior everything. By any reasonable calculation, he should have been crushed within the first season. Instead, he had won victory after victory, not through superior technology or greater numbers, but through simple unpredictability. He attacked when he should have defended. He advanced when he should have retreated. He extended his supply lines past all reasonable limits, gambling everything on speed and surprise. He did whatever his enemies least expected, the researcher explained, even when it meant taking risks that no rational commander would accept. "That is not a doctrine," Eth said. "That is just chaos." Yes, and it worked, at least until it did not. This was the pattern they kept encountering. Human tactics worked brilliantly until they failed catastrophically. There seemed to be no middle ground. A human general would achieve stunning victories through audacity and risk, and then one day the gamble would not pay off and they would lose everything. The Convergence way of war sought to minimize risk, to achieve steady advantages through careful calculation. The human way seemed to embrace risk as a feature rather than a flaw. Eth found another example in a commander called Stonewall Jackson. This human had earned his strange name by refusing to retreat when retreat was the obvious choice. He had held a position against overwhelming force, not through tactical genius, but through simple stubbornness. And then he had taken that stubbornness on the offensive. He had marched his soldiers faster than their bodies should have allowed. He had appeared in places where the enemy knew he could not possibly be. His soldiers had suffered terribly, dying from exhaustion and disease and the simple strain of keeping up with their commander's demands. But they had won. Again and again they had won. How did he convince them to follow him? Eth asked. He was asking them to die for him. Why did they agree? Her team investigated. What they found was perhaps the strangest aspect of human warfare yet. The humans told stories. They did not simply fight and win or lose. They wrapped their conflicts in narratives. They made songs about battles. They wrote books about generals. They built monuments to soldiers who had died in wars that had ended centuries before. And somehow, these stories motivated them to fight harder than any logical calculation of survival would suggest. Eth found the clearest example in a human named. This commander had led 300 soldiers against an army of hundreds of thousands. The mathematics were absurd. There was no possible victory. The only logical choice was surrender or retreat. Had chosen to fight. He and his 300 soldiers had held a narrow pass for several days before being completely destroyed. They had killed many of the enemy, but in the end, they had lost everything. By any rational measure, it was a defeat, a waste of resources, a pointless gesture. But the humans did not see it that way. The story of had spread across their world. It had inspired soldiers for thousands of years. The idea of 300 warriors standing against impossible odds had become something almost sacred to them. They had made songs about it. They had made movies about it. They had used it to motivate armies in wars that had nothing to do with the original battle. Motivation from defeat, Eth said slowly. How does losing inspire winning? Her team had no answer. The concept was too alien. Eth spent the next several rotations identifying what she came to call the Human Tactical Madness Index. She 17 approaches that any logical species would classify as insane. Attacks that had no chance of success. Defenses that relied on the enemy's inability to believe what they were seeing. Gambits that traded certain loss for uncertain advantage. When she programmed these approaches into the Convergence's standard war simulation system, the system flagged them as errors and refused to run them. The system is designed to eliminate illogical moves, her lead programmer explained. It cannot process tactics that violate basic strategic principles. Then reprogram it, Eth ordered. The reprogramming took 2 rotations. When it was complete, Eth ran the insane human tactics against the Convergence's finest strategic doctrines. The humans won 63% of the time. She reported her findings to High Commander. The meeting lasted an entire cycle, with Eth explaining each human tactic in detail, showing simulation after simulation. Human tactics work specifically because they are irrational, she concluded. Species that have achieved perfect logical optimization cannot anticipate moves that no logical entity would ever make. We have spent eliminating unpredictability from our warfare. The humans have cultivated it. Was silent for a long moment. You are telling me that their weakness is their strength. I am telling you that what we see as weakness, they see as something else entirely. They do not think in terms of logical optimization. They think in terms of stories, glory, honor, legacy. These are not strategic concepts. They are narrative concepts, and somehow they work. Can we counter them? Eth had been dreading this question. The answer was one she did not want to give. No, she said, not by thinking the way we currently think. A perfect logician cannot defeat an opponent who refuses to behave logically. The only way to counter human tactics is to adopt them. Scales shifted to a color Eth had never seen before. It might have been fear. You want us to become irrational. I want us to survive, and survival may require us to learn how to think like humans. The decision was not made that day or the next, but Eth knew that it would come eventually. The simulations did not lie, and somewhere in a distant dimension, humanity was growing stronger every day. The war for Dimension 4 had lasted for centuries. The Void Swarm had consumed entire star systems, their numberless drones sweeping through space like a tide of darkness. Every coalition force that had faced them had been destroyed or forced to retreat. The standard approach was to fall back, fortify, and wait for the swarm to exhaust itself against hardened positions. It was a strategy of survival, not victory. Everyone accepted that victory against the swarm was impossible. Had spent 2 cycles studying that assumption, and now she stood before the unified council of 17 species, preparing to challenge it. Operation Human, she announced, displaying the tactical overview on the main screen. This is what I am proposing. The other commanders studied the display in silence. What they saw did not look like any battle plan the Convergence had ever produced. This is insanity, Commander L said finally. His 12 eyes were blinking rapidly, a sign of extreme distress. You want us to feint with our strongest force, draw the swarm toward it, and then what? Attack through a dimensional fold that our own engineers have classified as suicidal. Suicidal, corrected. They estimate we will lose approximately 12% of any force that attempts the transit. And this is acceptable. It is what humans call a calculated risk. The chamber erupted in objections. For 3 cycles, the commanders argued, questioned, and protested. They ran simulations. They consulted experts. They demanded revisions. Made no revisions. She simply waited for them to exhaust themselves, and then she spoke again. We have fought the swarm for centuries using logical tactics. We have lost. Every time we have lost. The swarm is a perfect logical. It calculates our moves before we make them. It positions its forces with mathematical precision. It cannot be outcalculated. She paused, letting the silence stretch. But it can be out. The word was a human term. Ev had introduced it to the tactical vocabulary 2 rotations earlier. It meant to defeat an enemy by behaving in ways they could not predict, because no rational entity would ever behave that way. The council voted. The margin was narrow, but Operation Human was approved. The offensive began 3 cycles later. The first phase was a feint so obvious that no sophisticated enemy would believe it was actually a feint. The Convergence gathered its most powerful fleet in open space, making no effort to hide its presence. Sensor signals were broadcast on every frequency. The intention was clear: draw the swarm's attention. The swarm's tactical intelligences analyzed the situation. A massive enemy force, positioned in an obvious attack formation, making no effort at concealment. The logical conclusion was equally obvious. This was a distraction. The real attack would come from elsewhere. The swarm allocated minimal forces to counter the feint, just enough to delay and harass, while the main swarm forces searched for the true threat. They did not anticipate what happened next. The Convergence fleet leading the feint attacked with full commitment, not as a distraction, but as a genuine offensive. Ships that were supposed to retreat pressed forward. Commanders who were supposed to preserve their forces threw them into direct combat. The fleet was following the Nelson Doctrine. In human history, Admiral Nelson had achieved victory after victory by refusing to follow the established rules of naval engagement. When his superiors expected careful maneuvering, he charged directly into the enemy formation. When logic demanded preservation of forces, he spent them freely in pursuit of decisive victory. Now, Convergence commanders who had spent 2 cycles reprogramming their own instincts were doing the same thing. They attacked with an intensity that made no strategic sense. They took losses that no rational commander would accept. And the swarm could not understand what was happening. Its tactical intelligences had classified the Convergence fleet as a feint. Feints did not fight this way. Feints preserved themselves. Feints retreated when pressed. These ships were dying by the dozens, and still they came forward. The swarm began reallocating forces. Whatever this was, it required a stronger response. At that exact moment, the main Convergence force executed the second phase. The dimensional fold was classified as suicidal because it passed through a region of twisted space where the normal laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules. Ships that entered had roughly an 88% chance of emerging intact. The other 12% would be torn apart, crushed, or simply scattered across dimensions that had no names. Had calculated that 12% losses were acceptable if the survivors emerged behind the swarm's primary consciousness cluster. She was on the first ship through the fold. The transit was the worst experience of her 300-cycle existence. Reality twisted around her vessel like a living thing. She watched 2 of her escort ships simply disappear, there one moment and gone the next. She felt her own ship's hull screaming under pressures it was never designed to endure. And then they emerged. The swarm's consciousness cluster was the command center for the entire Dimension 4 campaign. 17 massive organic structures, each one home to billions of coordinating intelligences. From here, the swarm directed every drone, every assault, every movement across a dozen star systems. The cluster was defended, of course, but the defenses pointed outward, toward the approaches that any rational enemy would use. They were not designed to repel an attack from a direction that required suicidal navigation to reach. Gave the order to fire. The swarm reacted exactly as Eth had predicted. It began withdrawing forces from 6 different systems, pulling its distributed intelligence together to address this new threat. For the first time in centuries, the swarm was on the defensive. And that was when the third phase began. Commander Eth had spent 2 cycles studying the gambit. She understood, intellectually, why it worked. An enemy who expected rationality could not process an opponent who abandoned all pretense of self-preservation. The open gates of City had confused his enemies precisely because they made no sense. Now she was about to test whether the same principle applied to the Void Swarm. The Third Fleet emerged from behind a gas giant in a system the swarm had considered secure. Eth positioned her ships in an obviously vulnerable formation. She broadcast her tactical frequencies openly, allowing the swarm to see exactly what forces she commanded. She made no effort to hide, no effort to defend, no effort to retreat. Then she waited. The swarm's local forces studied this new development. They saw a small fleet, positioned badly, broadcasting its weaknesses for all to see. Every calculation told them the same thing. This was a trap. There must be hidden forces. There must be some strategy they could not perceive. They hesitated. In human warfare, hesitation was often fatal. A moment of indecision could turn the tide of a battle. The swarm's moment of indecision lasted exactly long enough for forces to destroy the first 3 spawning nodes. By the time the swarm realized that Eth's fleet was genuinely exposed, genuinely vulnerable, genuinely inviting attack with no hidden forces whatsoever, it was too late. The spawning nodes were gone. The consciousness cluster was under assault. And across Dimension 4, swarm forces were receiving contradictory orders as their coordination systems collapsed. The war ended in 11 rotations. Stood in the ruins of the final spawning node, watching the last swarm drones power down. Around her, convergent soldiers were still struggling to process what had happened. They had won. After centuries of defeat, they had won. And they had won by being insane. Eth found her there, staring at the wreckage. "The reports are coming in from all sectors," Eth said. "The swarm is broken, not just defeated. Broken. They cannot coordinate anymore. Their tactical intelligences are still trying to process what happened." "They will adapt," said. "Eventually, they will study what we did and develop counters." "Perhaps, but we will adapt too. We have learned something they have not." Turned to face her. "What have we learned?" That calculation is not enough. That optimization has limits. That sometimes the winning move is the one that makes no sense at all. Eth paused. "The humans have a saying, 'Fortune favors the bold.' I did not understand it before. I thought it was primitive superstition. But it is not. It is recognition of a deep truth about conflict." "And what truth is that?" "That in a universe of perfect strategists, the imperfect move becomes optimal. The enemy that does not optimize cannot be optimized against." Considered this for a long moment. Then she began composing her final report on human military philosophy. It would become required study for every convergence commander in every dimension. It would change the way they thought about warfare forever. She wrote, "The humans win not despite their irrationality but because of it. They fight as though they do not know the odds. Perhaps more importantly, they fight as though the odds are irrelevant. She paused, thinking about everything she had learned in the past several cycles, about Hannibal crossing the mountains, about Nelson breaking the line, about playing music while his enemies retreated. She added a personal note at the conclusion. We spent optimizing our tactics. The humans optimized their courage instead. We calculated how to survive battles. They calculated how to become the kind of beings whose stories would survive them. Against an enemy like that, calculation offers no defense. The Human Tactical Studies Division expanded to 14 dimensions within the next rotation. Every species in the convergence began studying human history, human psychology, human motivation. They learned about honor and glory, and the strange human need to be remembered. They learned about sacrifice and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept impossible odds. Some of them even began telling stories of their own. And somewhere, on a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of an ordinary galaxy, humanity continued fighting its small wars. They did not know that their generals had become required reading for beings they could not imagine. They did not know that their tactics were being studied across 4 dimensions. They did not know that their songs were inspiring soldiers who existed as pure mathematics. They simply kept doing what they had always done. They kept fighting. They kept losing. They kept winning. They kept telling stories about it afterward. And across the infinite expanse of reality, the stories spread.